BMW and Corvette resumed their rivalry with more fireworks at Road America. Meanwhile, Porsche and Cadillac did the same, with one of the championship favorites paying the price for it. And it wasn't just the wrecks at Road America. Well, yeah, I guess we should talk about it. Let's talk about the Motul Sports Car Grand Prix at Road America. What a wild race at Road America, and really it was a race of two halves almost. You know, we came into this race knowing that full course yellows were going to be a big factor in this, and in the first, I guess, hour and 40 minutes really of the race, full course yellows were a big factor. The second half had that very different feel. It still had plenty of incidents and plenty of beating and banging, but we had a strategy element that came into play here, and it heavily impacted the finishes in 3 of the 4 classes. Now, I think this is probably going to be a lengthy episode, so let's just get things kicked off right now with GTP. Now, there's a lot to talk about with the GTP class here, but before we do, I want to give that shout out once again to Imsa. I think they did a really good job with the BOP in this class. Every car, I think you could make a very legitimate and a very strong argument that they had the pace to be on the podium here. And in fact, in the final finishing order, we had all 5 manufacturers in the top 6. Even in qualifying, we had the top 10 cars featuring all 5 manufacturers separated by just under 7/10 of a second at the longest track on the calendar. That is impressive, and not just impressive by the Imsa technical team who puts the BOP together, but also by the teams for being able to extract that pace out of their cars. Now, the car that qualified 10th was the Aston Martin Valkyrie. Again, just about 7/10 off pole, which really not bad for them, considering this is the first time that this car is competing at Road America in their, of course, first season. I mean, I guess that's just kind of in general about this program. Like, what more can you say about the heart of racing and Aston Martin at this point? They just continue to improve with each and every race that goes by. They had a very, very quiet race at Road America, which is not something that you can say about most of the cars that were on the grid today, but it was a great race for them. They quietly went about their business. They stayed out of trouble en route to their best finish of the Valkyrie's young life, a 6th place finish. The next race for the GTPs is going to be at Indy, so I think the flat nature of that track with how that car has, you know, the learnings it can take from the World Endurance Championship with, again, those very flat, smooth tracks, as well as what they've done on the flat, very flat, smooth track here at Road America, I think that could apply well to Indy, maybe even enough that they could pull off their first top 5. The Aston Martin was actually matching the speed of the Porsche Penske Motorsports number 6 in the final stint of that race, which was pretty darn impressive. But overall, this was a disappointing race for Porsche. This is a track where they've won at the past 2 years in GTP, and in both cases, it kind of kicked off a late season charge for them. That was not the case this year. At the end of the day, the 963 was competitive. It was back up to that competitive level that we expect really all of the cars to be at. But they were definitely a step behind, you know, probably at least the BMWs, definitely Acura, and I think you could make a real argument that they were maybe just a little bit behind where Cadillac was, but generally speaking, they were all on the same competitive range. But credit where credit is due here. I think that some of the other teams are really stepping up. You know, Meyershank Racing has taken a big step forward in the past couple of months. Wayne Taylor Racing with the Cadillacs as well. They've brought those to really be competitive, and especially in the last couple of races. But to bring it back to Porsche here, the two Penskes did spend time at the front of this field, but they spent time at the front of the field. It was more so due to the pit strategy that they had used. I think they short-filled under one of the pit stops to get that track position. Once they would lose that track position again, they were never really able to charge back to the front of the field and were kind of just a bit stagnant there in the middle of the GTP class. But really, the race-defining moment, I feel like, for them came with under an hour remaining, and this is when Nick Tandy made, in my opinion, just a massive, not smart block on the 10 Wayne Taylor Racing Cadillac that forced them off the road and into a spin. Now, you have to leave a car width here when you have somebody on your inside, and there was definitely sufficient overlap that the 10 Cadillac deserved that space. If I'm going to be honest, I think it was a bit of a reckless move by Tandy, a driver who's so talented. But between this move as well as that move that was made at the end of the Laguna Seca race, which didn't result in a penalty, I don't know, it's just, I don't think it's necessary for this level of aggression. And it was that aggressiveness that really bit them, as Imsa brought the hammer down with the penalty that they handed out here. They had to come in and serve a stop plus 60-second hold for this incident, which really took them out of the running. They barely were able to hold on to the lead lap in this one, but they finished last in the GTP class. And while the 7 finished last, the 6 still managed to keep a top 5 at the end of this one. Alright, Cadillac is up next, and after a few races where it seemed like they were really picking up some momentum, picking up some steam, this race was really just meh for them. Alright, so the 10 was solid. The 10 was having a solid race. They were running 3rd at the time when they were caught up in that incident with the Porsche. They lost all of their track position though, of course, and they would eventually go on to finish in 8th. But the 31 was really quiet for the whole weekend, and the 10 was as well. I really don't know what else to say here about Cadillac. It just didn't seem like they weren't showing that race-winning pace like we've seen in the last couple of rounds, so just kind of a meh weekend overall for Cadillac. The 31 Whelen Engineering Cadillac would end up being the best finishing V-Series R in 4th, but just kind of a mediocre weekend for Cadillac. Now Acura, on the other hand, they were fast all weekend. After leading the opening 24 laps of the race, they got shuffled back a little bit during that first cycle of pit stops. Now throughout the race, it was pretty clear that the 93 was the quicker of the 2 cars in this one. And during the final stint, they were able to get past both of the Porsche Penske Motorsports entries, and really that's what let them take a stab at going for second or even the win in this one. I think that the 93 had the pace, the pace to win this race, but the way that BMW played that final stint, and the 25 dropped back to kind of hold up the 93 and let the 24 build out a bit of a gap, and I think the 93 probably had more pace than both of them, especially right there in the closing stages of the race, but BMW played the strategy and played that sort of gamesmanship, I guess you could say, perfectly. If the full course yellows fall a little bit differently here, then I think we could be talking about maybe Acura picking up their 3rd win of the summer, but instead they have to finish for 3rd place in the race. Ah yes, and then we have BMW. Fresh off the news that RLL won't be running that BMW program in Imsa next year, what do they go out and do? Well, of course, they go out and make up for those missed strategy calls earlier in the season that we gave them some flack about. So they make up for that, and they go on for easily their best finish of the season, a 1-2 finish. The race really was won here with the final cycle of pit stops, and BMW Team RLL played it perfectly. The 24 and the 25 both came down pit road as soon as they knew that they were going to have enough energy to make it to the end of the race. It was just a shade under an hour to go. And let's remember, this isn't necessarily a strategy play that we always see used. I talked about this in the S's pre-race newsletter, linked below, but just because the nature of this track, that you didn't lose a lap if you made a pit stop here, that I think, I said that I think we're going to see this play out in the race. We're going to see cars employ this strategy where you pit as soon as you can, and then if a full course yellow falls and you have competitors that haven't pitted yet, you're going to be able to leapfrog all of them for free, basically. That's exactly what happened. BMW made their pit stop before anybody else, and then what happens? A full course yellow comes out. BMW and all of their GTP class competitors then come down to the pits to make their final pit stop. BMW jumps them and goes to the front. It was a great strategy call, and both those BMWs were ultimately able to hold off that charging Acura for the 1-2 finish. The number 24 BMW M Team RLL entry completed 66 laps and edged out the sister number 25 entry by 2.5 seconds for their first win of the year. And then rounding out that podium, of course, was that hard-charging number 93 Acura. Overall, I'd say the LMP2s were a bit of a disappointment this weekend. There were plenty of incidents early on, such as the 22 United car, who crashed right after we started the race, although they actually spun out during the formation laps as well. The 52 PR1 Matheson car had a big accident as well that brought out a full course yellow. But I can say that late in the race, we did see some good battles unfolding in that final stint. We had a battle from 3rd down until I think 10th place. They were pretty much nose to tail for much of that final stint, and we did see some good racing there. In the end though, it was a dominant race for the 99 AO Racing entry as PJ Hyatt and Dane Cameron led all but 4 laps in the race to take their 2nd win in a row. The 43 Inter-Europol entry, who was without Tom Dillman this weekend, who is still recovering from the injuries sustained in that CTMP crash earlier in July, went on to finish 2nd, with Connor DeFilippi filling in that car, and the 11 TDS Racing entry rounded out the podium. Alright, let's talk about GTD Pro, and there was a lot going on here this race. So everything was shaping up for a very close weekend. The 81 Dragon Speed Ferrari edged out the 2 Corvettes by 1/100th and 2/100ths respectively for pole, so you knew at that point things were immediately going to be very tight this weekend. And really that close racing carried forward into the race as well. Now it was close, but not necessarily always clean, and with an hour and 20 minutes approximately remaining, that's where we really started to see that creep in. Here, the championship leading number 3 Corvette was spun right after a restart by the number 48 Paul Miller Racing BMW and made contact with the tires. Not exactly the first time we've seen a BMW take out a Corvette this year. Now the 48 from this incident would pick up a penalty, and they went on to finish 7th in class. Just after that happened though, the sister Corvette, who was also having a solid race themselves, was spun by the 77 AO Racing Porsche. Now there was no penalty here, as it did look to be definitely more of a racing incident. It looked like there was a checkup or something ahead of them, and the Porsche just didn't react in time and made some contact with the Corvette. It happens, it's a racing incident, but it really wasn't a great day for Corvette, who really fell victim to a lot of the carnage that took place in this race. Now, like we saw in GTP, there was also a really key strategic move made here in GTD Pro. The number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW was on pit lane when that last full course yellow was thrown. They had come in for their stop before the yellow flag came out, so they were able to complete their stop while it was a full course yellow essentially, so the field is going around slowly. They were able to exit, and then the rest of the class, of course, would come in and make their final pit stop. Meanwhile, the number 1's able to leapfrog all of them in the standings. The final 40 minutes of this race brought a lot of action as well. AO Racing took the lead in GTD Pro before having to pit with 14 minutes to go for fuel. They decided to play it differently with the strategy and tried to stretch their fuel, basically banking on another full course yellow, which never came. I believe the Vassar Sullivan Lexus also did the same thing. Pfaff also made some contact with the 4 Corvette, which got them a penalty. While the penalty was certainly justified, I'm not trying to go full homer here or anything. It was a justified penalty, but I was really wondering, I don't know if IMSA calls that a penalty if there wasn't the other carnage and lack of driving standards, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But I'm not sure if IMSA calls that a penalty in a lot of other instances. But regardless, it was a penalty for Pfaff. They came in, served that penalty. They had a really rough race, a really rough weekend overall. They made contact with an LMP2 down the front straightaway of practice that the comment that I saw in a Sports Car 365 article was the team manager was not very impressed with that incident. It totaled the car. They actually got a backup car, or borrowed Forte Racing's backup car for this race, so a lot of effort had to go into that for the team, and just not a weekend to remember for them. In the end though, it was that big strategy call for the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW, which I guess you could also say was a little bit lucky, but regardless, it got them the win in GTD Pro with Madison Snow and Neil Verhagen. They beat out the 64 Ford Multimatic Mustang and the 81 Dragon Speed Ferrari, who had yet another good finish. Before we go to GTD though, I want to quickly tell you about Paddock Focus Photography Workshops. You're already familiar with the incredible work of Paddock Focus co-host Jamie Price. You see his photos right here on the channel all the time. And now you can learn from him, as well as fellow motorsport photographer Drew Gibson right from the comfort of your home. Everything from how to become a motorsport photographer specific guides for some of the biggest races in the world. There's a ton of stuff on there, and for Off in the S's viewers, you can get 10% off by using promo code S's. That's promo code S's at paddockfocus.teachable.com or by clicking the link in the description. A big thank you to Paddock Focus for supporting the show. Okay, so GTD was a weird one, and it was a garbage day for all of the championship runners in this class. The 57 picked up a penalty for dive bombing the 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, although the 27 sure seemed to retaliate by just snowplowing the 57 off in the next turn, and even though they weren't penalized for that, I guess the 57 never technically went off track, but I ultimately think both of them probably should have got a penalty for this. And then you also have the 12 Vassar Sullivan Lexus, who also picked up a penalty for pushing the 57 off in Canada corner, so they had a drive through to serve as well. So with the top three in the championship all just squabbling amongst each other, who was gonna step up here? Well, the 34, the 021, and the 120 entries were all on pit road when that final full course yellow came out, much like the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW was. And like the 1, they were able to get all of that track position as well when the rest of their class competitors came in, so this was setting them up really well for the final stint of the race. Now, we saw a lot of passes being made in this final stint, especially in this GTD class, but the most notable one was the 021 Ferrari passing the 36 Corvette for the lead with just under 9 minutes to go. It was a bit of a rough pass, I will give it that, but it was definitely not as egregious as some of the other things that we saw in this race. The 021 Triarci competition Ferrari of Kenton Cook and Onofrio Triarci took the GTD class win ahead of the 78 Forte Racing Lamborghini, who capitalized really on their good karma for this weekend, lending that car to Faf to pick up second place, and the 34 Conquest Racing Ferrari rounded out the podium. We also had some support series present. We had the Michelin Pilot Challenge, which saw Jensen Altzman and Nate Cicero take the GS win with their Macumbi Macaleer Racing Ford Mustang, while the 33 Brian Herta Autosport Hyundai took the win in TCR with Mark Wilkins and Bryson Morris behind the wheel. In Porsche Carrera Cup North America, in the Pro class, it was Jimmy Libre winning race 1 and Tyler Maxon winning race 2. JP Martinez swept the Pro-Am races. Peter Atwater and Scott Blind picked up the wins in the Am class. In Lamborghini Super Trofeo, it was Hampus Eriksson and Danny Formal with a weekend sweep there. Jackson Lee and Trent Hinman picked up the race 1 win, while Conrad Geese and Jason Hart picked up the race 2 win in Pro-Am. In the Am class, David Staub won race 1 with Yam Hempworth and Lindsey Brewer taking the win in race 2, while in the LB Cup, it was Nick Grote who swept the weekend. And finally, there was the Mustang Challenge. In the Dark Horse class, Robert Noaker swept the weekend, and in the Dark Horse Legends class, it was Alex Bashura and Alfonso Diaz picking up the wins there. I've done this a couple of times this season, but I want to call out a surprise and a disappointment from each one of the classes this weekend. In GTP, Aston Martin surprised me. The Valkyrie has been steady as it goes this year, with picking up, just making sure it completes all the laps, picking up some solid results along the way, but this is the first weekend where it really seemed like they had solid pace. Like I said, they held on to the back of the factory Porsche Penske Porsche 963, and they were running really well in the final stint of that race, so Aston Martin surprised me a little bit here. As for the disappointment, I'm going to say Porsche was a disappointment this weekend. It's not just that penalty, but I was expecting Porsche at a track that they've been so successful at. It seems like it's a track that really suits that car. They just kind of came out and had a bit of a flat weekend, it seemed like. So we'll see how they bounce back at Indy, another track that they've had some solid results at, so definitely worth keeping an eye on, and we'll talk about the championship points in a minute, but they definitely don't want to let that door swing open. In LMP2, biggest surprise for me was Team Tonus. They had a really solid race here. They led a couple of laps here, the only non-Rex or non-Spike car that led laps in this race. They looked really solid all weekend long. I know that they put in quite a bit of testing time here to get ready for this race, but a really solid race for them. They deserve a shout out. They went on to finish 10th, but they were running really well for most of this race. As for a disappointment, the 74 Riley, they finished 11th, and they were running in third during the final stint. So I don't really know what happened to them. I don't know if there was some contact that was made or what happened, if they ran wide maybe somewhere, and with how tightly packed that group was from third down into about 10th. Something had to have happened there, I would assume, but just a disappointing weekend for them, and a weekend that they really needed a good result to stay there in the championship hunt, because there's just 2 races left for the LMP2s, and the point standings are AO Racing is starting to run away with it a little bit in LMP2. In GTD Pro, the 64 Ford Mustang picked up an impressive 3rd place finish. It was a quiet weekend for Ford. I've talked about quiet weekends for a few cars at this point, but it really was a quiet weekend for the Mustangs, and they were able to just power through and just stay out of trouble and pick up a solid finish. Well done to them. As for a disappointment, I'm just going to say the driving standards. I'll talk about it more in a couple of minutes here, but driving standards were really not great, especially in GTD Pro, I think. As for GTD, the surprise for me of the weekend was the 78 Forte Lamborghini. I joked about the good karma that they got from lending out their backup car to FAF for the race, but the Lamborghini hasn't been particularly strong here, and it's not like Forte had a great overall weekend either. They were just able to kind of find themselves in the hunt at the end of this race and pick up a good result from it. As for the disappointment, it's got to be the championship leaders here in GTD. The 57, the 27, and the 12. They had a horrendous final 40 minutes of the race. All of them showed solid pace over the course of this one, but they just got fighting amongst themselves, it seemed like. And really, at the end of the day, took all 3 of them out of reasonable points finishes. The 57 probably got the worst end of this at the end of it all, but still, just not a good race for any of those championship favorites. Speaking of the points, let's take a look at them now, and as always, they're presented by P1 Web Development. If you're a race driver, team, chassis builder, or engine shop who takes racing seriously, but your online presence is an afterthought, you are leaving money on the table. P1 builds sites that get you noticed, get you sponsors, and get your business taken seriously. You can visit the new P1 website at p1webdevelopment.com. Taking a look at the GTP standings, it's still the number 6 Porsche Penske Motorsports 963 leading the way with 2,314 points. That's a 75-point advantage over the sister number 7 entry. Now just 181 points back though is the 24 BMW, so closing in the gap a little bit there this weekend with the 93 Meyershank Racing Acura and the number 10 Wayne Taylor Racing Cadillac rounding out your top 5. In LMP2, it's the number 99 AO Racing entry that leads here with 1,682 points. That's 107 points ahead of the 22 United Autosports entry. The 74 Riley, 43 Inter Europol, and number 11 TDS Racing entries round out your top 5. In GTD Pro, it's a tight one here. The number 3 Corvette Racing entry still leads with 2,254 points, but it's just a 30-point advantage over the number 81 Dragon Speed Ferrari. The number 77 AO Racing Porsche falls back a little bit to 97 points back, with the 64 Ford Mustang and the number 48 Paul Miller Racing BMW rounding out your top 5. And in GTD, it's still the 57 Windward Racing Mercedes leading the way with 2,147 points. It's a 112-point advantage to the number 12 Vassar Sullivan Lexus, and a 117-point advantage to the 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin. The 96 Turner Motorsport BMW and the number 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche round out the top 5 there. Now, I've alluded to it a couple times during this video, but I do want to give my overall thoughts on this race at Road America. I personally wasn't a huge fan of what we saw out on track this weekend. The race was littered with poor driving standards from the drop of the green flag, you might even argue from before the drop of the green flag, and then just during the race, the lack of respect that was shown between some of the drivers was a little bit concerning. I don't want to single him out, but specifically the Nick Tandy incident with the 10 Cadillac bothered me a little bit, like that accident could have been so much worse with the bridge that was there. We've seen some really bad accidents with bridges, going back to the Michelin Pilot Challenge race last year at Mid-Ohio, a terrible accident into one of the sort of the bridges and where the barrier comes out there. This is in a very close spot to that, and although it's not as dangerous of a spot, I would say, as that spot at Mid-Ohio, this was still could have been so much worse. And really, like, incidents like this are completely preventable. This was just a huge block and really just unnecessary. You know that you're supposed to be leaving, you know, a car's width over there. I just hope that Imsa has a long chat with these drivers. It wasn't just Nick Tandy. That was really just the one that really sticks out in my mind. But there was so many incidents in this race, and you got to think that Imsa's going to have a long chat with the drivers before the race at VIR, and then when all 4 classes are back on the grid at Indy. You have to think that those drivers meetings are going to be long ones. That being said, though, I mean, we did have some good, you know, classic elbows out racing as well. I think that got overshadowed a little bit by a lot of the incidents that we unfortunately saw. And let's not forget here that elbows out racing is one of the things that makes Imsa so special. It's unique to Imsa, and there's definitely a fine line there of, you know, going over it, but definitely in this race there were a couple of incidents that went over that line. I really hope that, you know, the drivers are going to get that talking to. They're going to take it seriously, and they are ultimately going to make those adjustments to just have that little bit of elbows out racing and not anything over the line again. The other thing that I was a little bit disappointed in today was the broadcast, and specifically the Imsa TV, the international feed here, which is the one that I ultimately saw. And it was specifically to do with some things that were, you know, the way that the comms team was presenting the race to us, especially towards the end of this race. Here, I think John Hindhaugh just dwelled too much on the driving standards, or the lack of, that we were witnessing kind of throughout the final 40 minutes of that race. Literally, it was dwelled on for basically the entire final 40-minute stint of that race, while there was some great, clean racing going on as well. We're just bringing up, like, backhanded comments kind of about the driving standards that we saw, and just dwelling on it so much. I don't want that to be what we focus on, you know, during the race as it's being presented. We don't know how this is going to unfold yet. There was plenty of opportunities to talk about the strategies that various teams were employing and how that was working out for them. We heard a little bit about, you know, how those cars under that full course yellow, when that full course yellow came out, how they were on pit road, and, you know, we could follow that story a little bit more during the final stint, talk about some of the really close racing that we had going on in LMP2. I know that they touched on it for a moment there, but I just think we were dwelling way too much on the driving standards. It's one thing to weave that into what you were talking about, but it was really being dwelled on, and I didn't love to see that. I want to see us focusing really on the racing action and definitely calling out stuff like that when it happens. But I don't know, it did bother me a little bit that was the main focus that I felt like I walked away from the final 40 minutes of that race with. Anyways, that's the end of my rant. Let me know what you guys thought of the race down in the comments below. I'll be back hopefully later this week with at least one video. There's a few more that I have in the works, with more news that keeps coming out. It just kind of keeps stacking up. But in the meantime, you can check out this playlist for all of the 2025 Imsa season news. Huge shout out to all of the channel supporters. If you too want to support the show, you can head to patreon.com/offtheyeses or click that join button below. Once again though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.